Our topic is Joseph trusted God, and the question I have is, what do you do? How do you trust God in spite of hard times, tragedy, or maybe it could be something simply like stress? And the title of today's sermon is Trusting God in All Things. I guess, let me move more this way, I think. What's your initial reaction when things don't go the way you plan them to go? Life always takes, those turns on us. Things come up unexpectedly that we don't plan or that we don't expect. How do you react when the instability of a shattered life? It's not as easy to answer these questions, especially when you consider certain testimonies, like the one we just saw. These are becoming more and more prominent today, and to answer a question like that is getting a little harder to answer, considering the kind of culture that we live in today. In some cases, we're to blame for the difficulties that befall us. In other certain circumstances, it is no blame on our part. It's what somebody else does to us. Whatever the circumstances, the way we handle these certain circumstances, these situations in our lives, will determine the quality of and the vitality of our walk with God. Now, of course, we can just get by in life. We can have a decent life and make it by. But, God doesn't want us to just make it by in life. Jesus says that He came to give us life and give it to the fullest. And, what He's referring to is eternal life. And eternal life is when we meet Jesus. And when we meet Jesus on this side of the deathbed, on this side of eternity. And so He came to give us life even in this life, the best life we can have in this life. Now, it's not about having a big, luxurious life like we're going to see in the story, but what it does mean is it means we look to God for everything. Like He's our provider. He's the one that is going to show us where to go and how to live and what to do in certain circumstances. And when times get tough, if we want to run away from God, it's a little bit difficult to allow God to work in our lives and have His best, when we're always running away from Him. The life of Joseph is a really great story. It's a really great narrative. It's a real great true story that happened to a real man to meditate on when we're going through devastating situations in life. Our passage is going to be in Psalms chapter 105, verse 16 through 22. I'll let you guys turn there. Some of you guys are turning there. It starts off by saying in verse 16, He called down a famine, He, referring to God, called down a famine on the land and destroyed all their supplies of food. And He sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. Psalm 105 begins with the author, the psalmist, thanking God and worshiping God for all the great things that He has done. And he's recalling specifically the history of the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. And he's talking about how, he begins to talk about how God has called the people to Himself so that now God can take this people, grow them up as a nation, and reveal Himself to the rest of the world through this people. But in their early days, they had, in order to preserve them, in order to facilitate an environment that they could grow and flourish, He uses the Egyptian empire. But there's a lot of problems that Joseph goes through, that the nation of Israel goes through. And God uses a man named Joseph to bring the nation of Israel down to Egypt so that they can grow into a mighty nation. But the story for Joseph is not necessarily a smooth story. It's not a smooth transition. It's a very rocky story. Genesis 37 gives us a lot more background on this story. We see that Joseph was pretty much spoiled. He was a spoiled kid. He got everything he wanted. He was the favorite son of 12, and his brothers despised him for this. God even spoke to Joseph in 2 separate dreams, telling him that He was going to exalt Joseph, that He was going to use Joseph in a very big way. He's going to make him a mighty leader. And the result of this was that he was going to put his preservation on that he was going to use Joseph to preserve his people, to build them up. And, not only this, like when Joseph tells his brothers the story about how he's going to be this mighty leader and how even they are going to bow down to him, his brothers hated him even more for this, to a certain point that they even wanted to kill him. They said to him, here comes, this is one of the stories in Genesis. Joseph is coming up to his brothers. His brothers hate him. They want to kill him. They say, here comes that dreamer. They said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him in one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But then they have some kind of slight change of mind. The second oldest brother, Judah, comes up with this brilliant plan. He says, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianites merchants came by, they pulled the brother Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. So put yourself in Joseph's position. You're a favorite son or daughter. You're spoiled. You get everything you want, but your brothers hate you. So in one sense, there's almost like a miscommunication. From one party, you're getting all these praises. Oh, you're the best, you're the best. And on the other side, you're like getting all this condemnation, like we hate you, we want to kill you. And we see how, he's probably most likely a confused teenager. He's 17 years old, according to the narrative in Genesis. And but one day God speaks to him. I'm going to use you in big ways. I'm going to raise you up to be a mighty leader. I'm going to do great things in and through you. But soon after God speaks these great promises to you, the exact opposite happens. Your siblings deport you off to some foreign country to be a slave. It's not quite exactly what Joseph thought God had in store for him when God told him he was going to use him in a mighty way as to be a great leader. So I guess God's plan has been thwarted by his brothers, right? We see in verse 18, after being sold as a slave, Joseph was then accused of a crime that he didn't even commit. And when we look at verse 17 and 18, can you put verse 18 up there, please? When you look at verse 17 and 18, you almost think that they're the same, referring to the same event. We see in verse 17 how he's sold as a slave and that how he's in shackles. So you say, okay, he sold as a slave, and now he's sitting in prison. But in reality, those are two different stories. Those are two different episodes in the man's life. At first, when he was sold as a slave, he was sold to a prestigious man, a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was the captain of the palace guards for Pharaoh. So he's a pretty high man on the food chain. If you get my analogy, he's a very powerful man. So Joseph got sold as a slave to this man. And within a few years or so, God gives favor to Joseph in Potiphar's eyes. And God blesses all that Joseph does for Potiphar. And as a result, Joseph gets promoted to like the top leader, the top slave, the head slave. Well, I mean, I guess if you're going to be a slave, you might as well be the number one slave, right? I mean, it's looking a little more positive. But then hope begins to diminish again.